This is the pallet duck kayak. It's the Jackman version of the wood duck hybrid kayak from Chesapeake Lightcraft. I'll be building this kayak mostly from CLC's kit, more specifically the Wood Duck 14 hybrid kit. They include the parts and molds precision CNC cut at their shop, cedar strips milled at their shop, plus all of the hardware, wires, epoxy, and fiberglass, everything except for whatever varnish and paint you decide to finish it with. The 14 in the name, that's the length of the boat in feet. It's also kind of girthy too, designed for someone with a small passenger like a dog, a toddler, or simply just a big boy like me. Now the hybrid part of the name means that the bottom is built with stitch and glue construction from thin plywood, while the top deck is made from cedar strips. So a hybrid combination of two boat building techniques. But in true Jackman fashion, I told my friends at CLC to keep their fancy cedar strips. I'm going to make my own. From trash. But we'll start with the hull of the boat. All of the large parts are cut with puzzle pieces to allow them to be shipped, and then they get connected together with epoxy resin and fiberglass, two materials we'll be very familiar with after this build. I first sand, since this will be the finished surface under the fiberglass, and then apply epoxy in the joint, followed by fiberglass tape that is also saturated in epoxy. This is done for all four of the long pieces that make up the hull, two bottom panels and two side panels, plus the apron piece as well. Once cured, the excess fiberglass is removed, and at the same time I remove any tabs left behind on the pieces from the CNC cutting process. All of the pieces on my hull contact each other at different angles. This is accounted for with a block plane and some elbow grease. Really steep angles on the front and back, forward and aft, and less steep angles at the long seams. The construction method for the hull of the boat is what's known as stitch and glue. These copper wires are the stitches that hold everything together temporarily, and you'll never believe me when you find out what the glue is. Epoxy. It's epoxy. CLC pre-drills tiny 16th inch holes in all of the pieces, which are used to hold the stitches to align and hold the parts together. Safety wire pliers make quick work of twisting all of the stitches, so that my soft millennial hands don't get any blisters. But it's easy to get carried away with these if you're not careful. The stitches are left loose for now, and then tightened later as needed to pull the joints together. This allows for the bottom of the boat to unfold, and then I add two temporary forms, and also two bulkheads that will be permanent parts of the boat. One of the bulkheads gets customized by adding my hull ID number and name. The hull ID is required to be a permanent part of the boat on a spot both inside and outside the hull, a requirement of the US Coast Guard, and I know better than to mess with them. This laser engraving is infilled with TotalBuff's UV resin, which cures in seconds, so I can quickly sand it smooth and stitch that to the bottom panels of the boat. The side panels are definitely trickier. I start in the middle with a few stitches to hold the panels in place, and then work forward and aft, also adding this cute little transom panel at the back of the boat. I double check the hull for any twists. I know eyeballing some scrap wood doesn't seem very reassuring, but trust me, it works. And since the boards are parallel, I'm good to move on to gluing the hull together, which is a nice job to have a helper for. Any spot that I'm not able to pull tightly together with the stitches, I push the seam together with my hands, and some CA glue and activator is used to instantly tack that seam together. I repeat this anywhere there's a gap or misalignment, plus along the entire bow and stern, where I can now remove the stitches to get ready for the real glue to come out and play. With the kayak hull solidified with thickened epoxy at the joints, and some select fiberglass at the joints and in the seating compartment, I then sand the entire underside up to 220 grit, while also softening all of the corners in preparation for the first big fiberglass job. CLC throws in a roll of fiberglass with the kit, so I spread that out, roughly cut it to size, and then work out any wrinkles. I mix up a big batch of epoxy, quickly dump it onto the center line, and the goal? Saturate the fiberglass before the epoxy starts to cure faster than I can work with it. With my trusty squeegee in hand, I smooth out the glass, and once the glass is fully penetrated with epoxy, I remove any excess epoxy from the surface. The only tricky part of this shape are the two ends of the boat where it needs to be wrapped around the bow and the stern. Fiberglass doesn't like sharp curves, so this is done by making some cuts, wrapping it around one side, smoothing it out, and then overlapping it with the other side like a big fancy and sticky gift wrap. Once the epoxy has fully cured, I pull out the tool that's going to get a lot of mileage with this project, my random orbit sander, especially focusing on blending in the fiberglass overlaps so that they fade into the rest of the surface. This step also takes away any remaining gloss, so the next coat of epoxy will stick to the surface like it's supposed to. Now if you time things right, you can avoid sanding altogether by hitting the sweet spot where the first coat is gelled, when it's not liquid anymore, but still tacky. Now did I manage to time this right? Obviously not. But will I learn my lesson when I do the same process for the hull? Probably not. After removing any last sanding dust with denatured alcohol on a rag, I apply a fill coat of epoxy with a roller. This fills in the texture of the cloth, known as filling the weave, and also builds up some added strength and protection to the outside of the hull. I do 2 of these fill coats, and once that tacks up, I add a second fill coat. Before flipping the hull over, I find a couple pieces of plywood the width of the hull, and I scribe and cut them to fit. These get clamped to my sawhorses to perfectly cradle the boat. It's going to live here for a while, so I figured it should be comfortable. Next, it's time to deal with the excess fiberglass that was hanging off the bottom. It's solidified with epoxy now, so I satisfyingly cut it off with a sharp knife, which then leaves behind a razor-sharp edge, which I flatten down to the edge of the plywood with a block plane before it can hurt me. These MDF parts that CLC includes with the kit are the forms used to build the deck of the boat. I place them in the boat in order using the numbers that are engraved in them, and then use hot glue to hold them in place. These are temporary and just used to establish the shape of the hull of the kayak, so hot glue is perfect since it's strong enough to hold them in shape for now, but they'll still be easily removable once the deck is complete. Now's when it gets interesting. Shout out to my friend Julian for gifting me with an exotic palette with a bunch of these slats that I believe are something in the eucalyptus family of trees. I'm not really sure, but it looks fancy. The rest of the deck material comes from my shelf of pallet slats. I'm sure you won't be surprised at all to learn that I've been saving certain very special pallet slats for when I eventually build a boat. And about 5 years later, that time has finally come. The variety of species and colors that I was able to find in these pallet slats made the endless hours of milling worth it. Listed on the screen are all of the species that I was able to identify, or pretend to identify. 1/4 inch thick by 3/4 inches wide is what they were milled down to. Then I used 2 router bits to create a bead on one side and a cove on the other. This shape allows for the strips to easily follow the varying curved shape of the hull. Now the next problem I've created for myself is that my boat is 14 feet long, and the pallet slats are less than that, much less than that actually, around 3 feet max. But I have a plan. To rectify this, I'll use a scarf joint to attach multiple strips together, which is really just a fancy word for an end grain joint created using a really steep angle on the ends of the pieces to give you a large glue surface. Scarfing also allows me to dodge around most of the pesky knots and nail holes, so it's a win-win. I achieved this by creating this custom jig for the table saw with a fence set at somewhere around a 15-degree angle. And I also add a feather board to keep the strips locked in place while I'm cutting them. I lay out the strips on the only surface that's long enough to hold them, the floor, and use tape to hold the joints in place. TotalBuff epoxy mixed with wood flour to a runny consistency is used to create a really strong connection at all of these scarf joints. I slap that on with a chip brush at each of the joints, and then use a spring clamp along with the blue tape to hold it all together while it cures. Now I have some really long pallet wood strips that I just need to remove the excess epoxy from. My sander does a bulk of the work, and then for the bead and cove edges, I wrap a scrap piece of one of the strips with sandpaper and use that profile to remove the epoxy to keep the shape of the strips intact. Honestly, this is a bit of a painful process working on the floor, plus all the added sanding, so I only do this for the first few strips on each side to establish the shape of the deck. The last bit of preparation before installing strips is covering the forms and the hull with blue tape to ensure that the strips don't stick to it. Other than the final strip, the first strips are the trickiest and take a lot of time to lay out correctly. I start at the bow and use a fancy digital angle finder to find the angle, and then divide that angle in half to trace on the first strip. A jigsaw is used to cut this steep angle, and then my block plane smooths out that cut and brings me down to the line. To clamp these strips together, I use CA glue to temporarily install some blocks at the right angle, and this allows me to clamp my first strips together while the epoxy cures. Now, the typical process for installing strips involves using staples to hold the strips to the form while you glue them together. But me, I'm apparently too good for that. Even though this is my first time strip building a boat, I'm going to avoid those holes in my strips with some extra clamps and some other clever clamping techniques that I developed. You'll see. The only exception to that is my first strip, which I brad nail in place to establish the initial curved shape. The compound bend is fairly extreme, and naturally, I made it difficult for myself by choosing a fairly dense material for the first strips, just because they looked cool. So now is when I have to deal with those consequences of my decisions. But they're small enough holes, so I'll be able to hide them later. And here's the fun part, the deck design. CLC provides 2 tones of cedar strips for the deck, but I have a whole rainbow of colors to play with. After a few sketches, this is what I came up with. The outside profile is a sandwich of the dark exotic wood and a thinner strip of maple in the middle. And I matched that look along the center line of the boat too. I followed that with 2 strips of cherry, a strip of white oak, and then finally a thin accent strip of maple to frame all the unique palette strips that I've been hoarding over all these years. These will mirror each other on each side of the boat, but with each end being different so that I can work in as many species as possible. Woohoo! So the next strip is this thinner accent strip made from maple. It's a similar process to the first one, following the border of the deck, except these strips are just clamped in place. And with that, I'm also now able to establish the center line of the deck of the kayak with this maple strip with a bead on both sides. This has the added challenge of fitting it into the cove of the previously installed strip, but that's just a matter of planing and sanding that curved profile on the end. The strips are glued to each other with Titebond 3 wood glue, and I also use Titebond CA glue to hold these first few center strips to the forms so that they remain perfectly set on the center line of the boat. I do the same process at the stern, and then sandwich that center strip with a couple more pieces of the dark exotic strips. It's a slow and methodical process, custom fitting every strip, but it is fun to watch it gradually come together to make the image that was in your head, just one strip at a time. So other than just using an excessive number of clamps, plus clamping the strips down to the forms, the favorite clever clamping technique that I've created was using some screw clamps clamped to the deck. Not because they were actually holding anything, but simply to use as a surface to wedge against. As strips are installed, I trim a few at a time to fit roughly around the apron piece that will be fitted later. But other than that, it's pretty straightforward, just with each piece developing a steeper and steeper angle as I progress. Slowly making my way down the strips. Walking fast, faces past, and I'm homebound. Then I reach a certain point where the front and back of the deck converge with the penultimate strip. And then comes the whiskey plank. The name given to the final plank of the boat because, well, you'll probably need a special beverage after wrestling it into place. But I just carefully measure, scribe out, and cut the long curve, which is then sanded, a bead is routed into the edge, and it's trimmed, fit, trim, fit, trim, fit, until finally it fits. Rinse and repeat on the other side, and then the only way to secure this thing is lots of glue and throwing every clamp I own at it to keep this whole precarious mess together until it dries. Next, I pull out another slat that I've been saving for a while.
Walnut.
Believe it or not, I've got a few of these in my pallet hunting journey, and I figured this is worth a special place in my kayak too. The apron piece is made out of the same 1/4" Akume plywood as the hull of the boat, but of course that's not good enough for me. So I customize it by throwing it in my laser cutter and adding in the pallet duck name. I do the same with my piece of walnut pallet wood, so that I can create a cool inlay located just behind the seat of the boat. Blue tape is used to temporarily hold all of the pieces in place. Then I pull out the Titebond CA glue again, the thin stuff this time, and flood the perimeter of the letters where it will soak in and lock them in place. And for the Jackman Works engraving, I pull the same trick as I did with my hull ID on the inside of the boat and infill it with TotalBuff UV resin. Then I'm able to send the whole assembly through the drum sander to smooth out both sides and reveal the inlay. Meanwhile, back at the deck of the boat, I take my belt sander and go to town on all of the glue squeeze out. Just some rough sanding for now. This leaves me behind with a smooth enough surface so I can do the final fit of the apron. I get it fitted into its final position and trace the perimeter where I cut carefully with a jigsaw with a smooth metal cutting blade in it. There's not much room for error, so I slowly refine the fit with a file until I create the perfect opening for it. Next, it's time to flip things over and work on the underside of the deck. So I scribe the plywood again, this time to fit the profile of the deck of the boat. Now all that's holding the deck in place are these brad nails along the edges and the glue on the blue tape of the forms. I slowly and carefully persuade them to separate with the use of a putty knife. And with that free, there's a lot of cleanup work ahead of me. After the teardrop camper, and now this project, I'm pretty good at filleting in tight spaces. But just like the hull, these joints and fillets need to be reinforced with some fiberglass tape. But that's easier said than done. To make the process less painful, I pre-cut the fiberglass tape and then lay it out on a piece of melamine where I saturate it with epoxy and then roll it back up. This allows me to simply bring these pre-saturated pieces of fiberglass tape to the seams, where they will then be installed by rolling them out, smoothing out any wrinkles, and removing any bubbles. And then this same process is repeated for all of the inside seams. Once that all cures, the temporary tape and straps that were holding the deck in place are now removed, meaning the kayak is finally in one piece. I left a little bit of an overhang around the perimeter of the design to give me some flexibility when attaching the deck, but a router with a flush trim bit is now used to remove any of that excess. And then, unsurprisingly, there's more sanding for me to do. I smooth out the entire side of the boat and also work my way up through the grits on the deck now as well, completely smoothing it out. At the same time, I round over the edges of the deck to make a smooth transition so that the fiberglass will be able to easily flow around that corner. There are a few nail holes and other imperfections left here and there, so I mix up another batch of epoxy thickened with wood flour to fill these in, and once cured, sand them flush. After final sanding with 220 grit, it's time for the most exciting step of all. Other than launching the kayak, I guess, it's time to fiberglass the deck. This process will seem familiar because I've shown this to you a couple of times now. This time is just visually so much better. With the fiberglass spread out, another batch of TotalBuff epoxy is mixed up and poured onto the deck to reveal all of the stunning colors living inside the trash that makes up the deck of my kayak. I quickly spread out the epoxy on the deck to wet out all the fiberglass using a combination of chip brushes and squeegees, running the sheet down the side of the boat too for some extra reinforcement. So you see how I'm working out from the center. What you really want to do is start kind of down the middle, center the boat, and work your way either direction, because that just kind of sticks down the glass down the middle, and then you work your wrinkles out. But I'm just kind of quickly trying to get it spread out, because once it's thin, rather than in the cup, it's not going to kick off as quick. And when it's thin in a layer on top of the boat, I'll be able to spend some more time working it in. Like you see how there's some movement still. And I can kind of pull, and you can see the glass moving here as I squeegee it out. So that's kind of how you shift things around if you need to do that to pull out wrinkles. So I got a little bit of wrinkle worked in here. I got to work it that way off the end of the boat, but you can just pull this cloth back and pull that wrinkle this way. Just squeegee out all the extra so you have that bit of texture. You can see the weave through the resin, and then you'll come back and overcoat afterwards. If you leave too much and it has pools of resin, the glass actually wants to float on the resin and will lift off. So you want that right there. Yeah, that's the good stuff right there. Do that. Okay. Again, the only real tricky part is the bow and the stern, where I need to do some creative, methodical overlapping work. And this time, I actually remembered to do the fill coat a few hours later. And don't forget about the hatches too. Again, CLC provides a perfectly sufficient 𝐂𝐤𝐚𝐻 plywood coaming to go around the seating area, but the wires that cross in my brain mean that I have to let perfect be the enemy of good, and I make my own rainbow pallet wood version of that piece. And speaking of, the toggles that hold the hatch covers in place, same deal there too. Instead of using the perfectly good plywood ones that come with the kit, I decided to make my own out of a piece of Santos mahogany pallet wood that I found. And while I'm at it, I also create some carrying handles out of the double lamination of pallet wood, combining some random lamination scraps from previous projects. This chunk of half pallet wood, half wood glue is then milled down square and cut to length before I use a round over bit in the router table and quite a bit of freehand sanding to create a shape that's comfortable in my hand. Drilling 2 carefully sized holes will allow a rope to pass through, but also inset the knot that I tie in that rope. I create one of these handles for each end of the kayak, and then cover them with a couple protective coats of epoxy, just like the hatch toggles. To attach these handles, I decide to drill a hole through the bow and stern of the boat and install stainless steel sleeves. The notches cut into these sleeves will help hold them in with epoxy later, but from now I just gently slide them into place. To hold those in place, I'll be doing end pours, which CLC recommends anyway to reinforce the bow of the boat that might take an impact once in the water. Don't do this on a windy day, and be extra careful the boat doesn't fall on someone. Although a bit precarious, I just need to prop the kayak up on end, mix up some epoxy with lightweight silica thickener, and pour it into the end of the boat. You can see it surrounding one of the sleeves here. And with it being a large mass of epoxy, it cures quite quickly, so I'm able to do the pour in both ends in a fairly short period of time. And next, I'll kick off the finishing process with TotalBuff's TotalProtect, which is a 2-part epoxy primer that's mixed together in a 3-to-1 ratio. This is a super rugged coating that also sticks incredibly well to the surface, so I choose that to use as a coating on the inside of the storage areas on both ends of the boat. And guess what? You'll never guess. More sanding. You guessed that, didn't you? The entire outside of the boat gets sanded now. The important part is deglossing the epoxy to give something for the varnish to stick to, but this also levels out any drips in the top coat of the 3 coats of epoxy that I applied to the outside. This starts with 100 grit and stops when I get to 220. It's a time-consuming process, but it's important since it's going to be the finished surface of the boat, so I want it to look perfect. With the sanding complete, I brush and vacuum off the boat and remove any last dust with denatured alcohol on a rag. You'll notice that the floor is super clean now too, which is important because I don't want to stir up any dust and get it into my varnish, which is starting now. TotalBuff's Gleam 2.0 Gloss Varnish. I chose this because it's very easily workable and has a nice subtle amber tint to it that will highlight the natural colors in the kayak. I start on the hull, and the technique is fairly simple. Roll and tip. Spread the varnish out in a super thin layer using a roller, and then use a brush to tip off any bubbles and create an even coat. It sounds simple, but it's hard to master. I still haven't gotten there yet. I do the same on the underside of the hatch covers, where you'll see off camera I installed some blocks of wood to help hold them at the correct curvature to match the boat, since they didn't want to do that on their own. I build up 8 coats on the hull and all the extra pieces, and then flip the kayak over and do the same treatment to the top side, just rolling and tipping the varnish, being very careful to avoid any drips, especially around the perimeter of the deck and around the seat opening where they want to happen the most. After 8 coats to the top, it's time to rig the kayak up with all of its accessories. Deck bungees, weather stripping, seat back, hardware, footrests, and a foam seat cushion. kayak is done now? Well, not quite. It's done enough to bring it downstairs and make a trip over to Connecticut for the Wooden Boat Show, where my kayak got to hang out at the Chesapeake Lightcraft booth. There were a ton of incredibly impressive handmade wooden boats on display at the show. Most were fancier than mine, and most were a little bit larger than mine, but as far as I could tell, none of the other boats was made from trash. So I've got that going for me. Now I learned many things at the show, mostly that I have a lot to learn, which I honestly already knew, but I also learned that my varnishing skills weren't quite as terrible as I thought they were. Yet at the same time, it's still not as perfect as I wanted it to be, so when the boat got home, back in the barn it went. I removed all of the rigging and decided to take another swing at the varnish. To build up more coats, I decided to use TotalBoat's Halcyon Clear this time. It's a water-based varnish that's super easy to work with, plus I didn't want the color of the kayak to get any more amber than it currently was. I built up another 10 coats of varnish by spraying it this time, which gave me a pretty good result. And as a final coat of finish on the bottom 2 panels, I decided to do paint on top of the varnish. TotalBoat Elixir in Fire Red. This added a pop of color as a contrast and also worked really well with the colors and the wood tones of the boat. I'm still not sure if that was the right decision, but I think I like it. Now for the seating compartment, I got inspired by some canoes and kayaks at the show that had this sleek looking matte interior, so I decided to replicate that. To do that, I used TotalBoat's Matte Lust Varnish, which is a very thick varnish that lays out really nice, and once it dries, it has almost no sheen to it, which is exactly what I'm looking for here. To prevent any drips, I do each side of the boat one at a time, allowing the varnish to mostly dry before moving on to the other side and the bottom. Now the top deck is what I'm most concerned about, since that's going to be getting the most eyeballs on it. I sand down the surface of the varnish with 320 grit paper just to scuff up the surface and level out any inconsistencies that were left behind with the previous coat. I built up about 8 coats of Halcyon varnish on the deck just like I did on the underside, and then for the final coat I go all out, scuffing the surface with 600 grit sandpaper, meticulously removing all of the really fine dust with a tack cloth, filtering out the varnish, and with all that preparation, roll on one final coat. It ended up taking me a couple of attempts, but I got it absolutely perfect. Just kidding. Most people wouldn't even share this with you because the current finish honestly looks great on camera. But I'm not most people, and because my brain doesn't work properly, I won't settle for anything less than perfection. So I'm going to share that with you. Here we go, with me pulling out my fine finish sandpaper starting at 600 grit and then working my way up to 2000 grit, which starts at smoothing out any remaining brush marks and tiny inconsistencies. And by the time I get to the 2000 grit, I can start to see the shine come back. Next step is TotalBuff, a rubbing compound that is the first step in TotalBoat's 3-part buffing system. I apply way too much to the surface, and then use a wool buffing pad to methodically buff out the side of the kayak. Next is TotalShine, part 2, that has an even finer grit in it, and after which you can see a perfectly smooth and shiny surface starting to form. And last, the final step is their boat wax, which I wipe on and wipe off a couple of times to finally reveal the perfect finished surface that I've been after. And since I've proven this method to myself on the sides of the boat, I repeat the process for the deck. And finally, after a couple solid weeks of working on the varnish, I finally have that smooth, glassy finish. Although if I'm being honest, it was probably longer than that, but I don't want to even check because I don't want to know the actual truth of how long I toiled over this. But the important part is that I'm done now, and with the rigging reinstalled, I can finally drop the boat in the water, completing this project that has been bouncing around in my head for nearly 2 decades. Now, that could be you. No, it should be you. All my tongue-in-cheek whining might make this build seem a little bit overwhelming, but it is super achievable in just a whole bunch yet finite amounts of small steps. And the biggest thing that makes this so achievable is Chesapeake Lightcraft with their designs and kits. With over 100 different designs to choose from, and the options ranging from paper plans to complete kits, you have no excuse not to build a boat. And I'm not even joking about this being a couple of decades in the making. The idea of building a kayak started bouncing around in my brain as a teenager. I was even able to find some of the sketches where I was trying to figure out the designs and dimensions. Oh, to be a teenager again and not know what you don't know. Although in the meantime, I did build a guitar boat, pirate ship, hammock boat, RC boat, in a teardrop camper, quote unquote, boat. But this is my first real boat, and CLC is the reason I finally took that idea across the finish line. And now, as Paul Jackman, the master boat builder, I genuinely think everybody should have this experience. Check out the links below to learn more about CLC and all of the rest of the sponsors of this video. Besides their kits, CLC is also a great resource for marine plywood, boat building lumber, tools, building supplies, and other marine hardware and supplies. And if you're ever in the Annapolis, Maryland area, definitely stop by their showroom to check out all the model boats that they have on display. But for now, master boat builder Paul Jackman is off to start planning which boat he's going to build next.